And formally welcome everyone to our weekly call, which this week, given it's the week before the IETF meeting, we will, as we often do, spend some time looking at the agenda of the meeting. So as you're hopefully aware, we'll do a sort of preview some of the more interesting items on the agenda. Obviously, I've looked at the agenda through my own lens of things that I'm interested in, so I will call those out. But certainly, as I think I put in the invite reminder, welcome any input from anybody else if there's anything as we go through that you think I've overlooked that people should pay attention to. So please do pop something in the chat or raise your hand, and I will intend at least to pause as we go through as well. So hopefully along the way, give a chance for anyone to interject with anything you believe I've missed. And then, as always, we just sort of talk through some of the sort of news headlines, etc. after that. So, without further ado, I'm just going to, as I usually do, I'm just going to go through the agenda through the week, just pulling out items from each day that caught my eye. And I should also say a health warning. Probably about 3/4 of the sessions had agendas when I went through yesterday afternoon, early evening. There's probably a few more have been added since, so do bear that in mind. If there's not a lot of detail on some things, that's because it wasn't available when I looked yesterday. With that caveat, right, first things first, a reminder that the hackathon, as always, kicks off on the Saturday and runs over the weekend with results presentations on the apologies, on the Sunday afternoon. So those of you that are in Brisbane for the weekend, if you weren't planning to, it's well worth looking in on the hackathon, even if you're not playing an active role. There's usually a lot of people around for the entirety of that. And of course, I think it was the hackathon at the meeting in Prague which spawned the Deleg proposal, which we'll come back to shortly. So as well as many other interesting things. So definitely worth your time if you're in the area. I've never really thought about this. Can you attend that remotely? I don't know that you can. I don't think it's set up that way. If anyone thinks differently, please correct me, but I believe it's all on site. And then there is a tutorial on BGP also on the Sunday between 3 and 4 p.m. local time. So anyone wants to take part in a sort of deep dive tutorial, then that's happening mid-afternoon. And then between 4 and 5, any new participants, that's sort of loosely defined as anyone that's attended 5 meetings or less. There's an opportunity to participate in a quick connections sort of networking event. You do need to pre-register, so do bear that in mind, but definitely worthwhile to just sort of hook up with some other people that are still relatively new to the community and sort of navigating their way around. So worth going to, but remember to pre-register for that. And then for the rest of us, the welcome to the country and welcome reception starts at 5, runs through till 8. With, if I recall from the details in email, I think with a cash bar for the welcome reception, and also between 6 and 8, as it always happens, is the hot RFC lightning talks, which I presume, I haven't looked at the floor plan, are sort of somewhere very close by. They typically are pretty much next door. So that's a chance to sit in on a whole series of presentations limited to 4 minutes on a diverse range of topics, some of which will be on the agenda for discussion during the week. Some might be talking about side meetings and other topics of interest, but the main criteria is they have to be 4 minutes or less. That usually goes quite quickly if you're sort of sat there with a bottle of beer or two to pass the time. So good to do. Okay, so that gets us through the Sunday into the agenda proper. And there's a few innovations on the agenda. So the first of which is the all dispatch session taking place, session 1 on Monday. So this replaces various different dispatch groups that took place through the week for the different IETF areas. That's all consolidated into a single dispatch group. And that's as an experiment for this meeting, so we'll see how that goes and whether it works. It will be interesting actually just to see different things. So that should mean people get visibility to a more diverse set of topics than perhaps you might do if you only go to a specific dispatch area. I've listed in the right hand column some of the topics that I just sort of pulled out from the agenda as it currently stands. I'm not going to read through all of those. You can see them on the screen, but that's just a range, a selection of topics. There are more than that, but those just caught my eye. So it's quite diverse, as you can see, subject matter for the all dispatch session, as you would expect. Then in session 2, the two items that caught my eye. One is the measurement analysis for protocols, the MAP research group. And again, I've sort of pulled out some agenda items from that, such as looking at the spin bit, low latency networks, which I know Jason Livingood is covering, etc. Again, I won't go through those. Mobile app filtering in India is another one. So it's a research group, so it takes a slightly different approach to the IETF working groups, and is none the worse for that. And that is taking place at the same time as the workload identity multi-system environments, BOF, which when I looked yesterday, there wasn't agenda yet, but you'll see I sort of pulled out from the, I think it's a draft charter at this stage, that it will focus on the unique identity and access management aspects of workloads at runtime and their execution context, particularly focusing on the propagation, representation and processing of workload identities, hence the title. So it may be up now, but if not, sometime in the next few days, no doubt a more detailed agenda will appear to give you more details on that. But that's the sort of gist of the overall subject matter that BOF is proposing to tackle. And then also in session 2, network management operations is taking place, which I was actually quite pleased to see on the agenda. I've not picked up on this one previously. A much more operational focused session, trying to sort of tease out some sort of network management sort of challenges and solutions. And again, on the right hand column, I pulled out sort of 3 things that caught my eye specifically, which were anomaly detection, incident management, and collecting updated operator requirements for ITS network management solutions. So that's more sort of practically focused, if you will, than some of the other sessions. So those of you more on the network management side, that may well appeal to you if either the BOF or the MapRG sessions don't. Then between 4 and 5 local time, there's a side meeting. And I should say at the moment, none of the side meetings had any additional details, at least none that I could see. This one has the title of Update on Universal Name Systems and Universal Certificate Authority. I can't tell you any more than that because literally there's no other information available. But the universal name systems aspect of that in particular caught my eye. So that may well be of interest. I don't know if anyone else, if that side meeting has been held previously, or there's anything on any of the mailing lists. But if anyone's got any more to add on that, useful to know. But I'm just flagging that purely based on the name rather than any other information being available currently. If anyone does have any details you can add, by all means pop in the chat or just raise your hand or unmute and say something, and let me know. That'd be much appreciated. But whilst you're thinking about that, I'll just finish off Monday to say that the DNS Ops session is taking place in session 3. It's the first of 2 sessions for the DNS Ops working group. There's one later in the week. As always, it's got a really full agenda, and I couldn't really see anything easy to sort of pick out to highlight. Very to put the title in slightly different order, very operationally DNS focused, as you would expect. So those of you who have that general interest, there's bound to be a lot of stuff of interest to you, but there's a detailed agenda available. So just take a look at that on the IETF site at your leisure. But there's a lot in there. It usually, to me, looks like there's far more than could possibly covered in the available time slot. But the chairs usually manage to do so with a minute or so to spare. So they're well versed in just about working to time, despite the packed agenda. So simultaneously with that, there's an ops and management area working group which is intended to cover stuff, so ops and management topics that aren't in the scope of any of the other ops working groups and don't warrant a BOF or a working group of their own. Again, it had quite a diverse agenda is available, but there wasn't anything obvious to pull out from that. So again, that'll be worth a look if you're not attracted to the DNS Ops session. And then in session 4 on Monday, you've got the choice of either the IETF open session, which includes sort of anomaly detection in the open world, normality shift detection, explanation and adaptation as a topic. Or at the same time, there's the OHI, Oblivious HTTP Application Intermediation working group, which again, amongst other things on the agenda, includes a presentation on chunked OHTTP, a topic which has been discussed on the OHI mailing list, and also the DAP use case for unreliable oblivious HTTP extension, which I'm not quite so sure about that one, but I know the chunked OHTTP has definitely been a discussion in the last few weeks on the OHI list. And then to round off Monday, there's a new participants dinner, same criteria as before, so 5 or less meetings, although I don't think it'd be that strict if you've attended 6. But you do need to pre-register for that, or at a similar time you've got the hack demo happy hour taking place as well. So both of those are taking place on the Monday in the evening. Right, let me pause there for a moment and see if anyone wants to call out anything else from the Monday which you feel has been overlooked before I move on. I'm not seeing any obvious typing in the chat, and I can't see any hands raised, so let me press on. But if anything occurs, then please interrupt and we can go back. Okay, right, so on the Tuesday, first thing Tuesday, there's a sisters networking event taking place, and then when we get to the agenda proper, we've got the much talked about Deleg BOF bit being held. So we've discussed that previously on this call. It was discussed in the RIPE meeting at the OARC session for a month ago now, and is as I mentioned earlier, is sort of an issue that arose from the hackathon at the meeting in Prague, and the working group. So the BOF is intended to include a charter discussion, so that's currently on the agenda for that BOF. So I think that will be really interesting. In the event that you're not attracted to that, there's also the TLS working group taking place at the same time. The main thing which caught my eye, you won't be too surprised to know, is early in the agenda there's scheduled to be an ESAGE update from the chairs. It should have gone to last call, working group last call, that is, immediately after the last meeting in Prague, but didn't for various reasons. So I'm guessing the chairs are going to give their take on what the current status is and whether they're going to announce a move to working group last call, or whether they're going to announce a bit more tweaking is required before the draft is ready for that. But I think it's there or thereabouts from the sort of discussions on the mailing list for TLS. Okay, we've got a second BOF on Tuesday morning in session 2, which is secure patterns for internet credentials, or SPICE. There was a BOF for that topic in Prague. Those of you that attended that meeting may recall, which is looking at credentials and the exchanging of credentials. It referenced one of the drivers for the BOF was the European Union's digital ID requirements, and it's intended to look across various existing IETF technologies to provide, if you like, an overarching sort of architecture on credentials, is my understanding. Then on Tuesday, actually I'm not sure that session is taken, I think that's on Monday, so you can disregard that entry on the Tuesday. I think that's an error on my part. I think that I've moved from Tuesday to Monday, so I don't think that side meeting's taking place twice, unless I've misread the side meeting agenda. So we'll move swiftly on to session 3, which is MASK, which amongst other things has got topics listed including quick aware proxying using HTTP, proxying listener UDP in HTTP, and proxying Ethernet in HTTP, and a bunch of other stuff. That's just a selection of things from the agenda for MASK. And then finally on the Tuesday, MIMI, more instant messaging interoperability, has got the first of 2 sessions. It's got another one later in the week, a bit like DNS Ops. So the agenda for the first session is specifically focused on user discovery requirements to get interoperability between different instant messaging systems. And that coincides with MADINES, or the MAC Address Device Identification for Network and Application Services working group, which, as you can see, they're going to give a summary of where the group is at, look at use cases, problem statements, etc. Right, again, I'll pause there to see if anyone has got anything to add. Well, either any comments on anything that I've covered, or indeed anything to call out that I've overlooked so far. And as before, if you have, pop it in the chat, or unmute, raise your hand, say something. Okay, doesn't look like that's the case at the moment, so let me move on to Wednesday. I couldn't see anything of immediate interest session 1 on Wednesday for me, so that's currently blank, although Tuesday's quite busy, so that maybe is no bad thing. The IB Open meeting takes place in session 2, and there are quite a few things, I'm not going to list them all out, on the agenda for discussion, which looked really interesting. So you can see a number of items there, all of which have got agenda time. I will mention specifically the M10. There's a further report from the IB workshop on the management techniques in encrypted networks. So that's one of a number of items that's on the agenda. And then, if you like, the last half hour or so is an invited talk on techniques for detecting known illegal material in end-to-end encrypted communications. Do they work? Are they secure? With Vanessa Teague from the Australian National University based in Melbourne. She was one of the co-authors of the Bugs in Your Pocket report critiquing client-side scanning. So that should be an interesting discussion, I'm sure. There's also a quantum internet research group taking place at the same time, but there wasn't any agenda for that when I last looked. Again, there may well be by now. Session 3, you got privacy pass, which working group, which includes a couple of adoption calls on the agenda. And that coincides with RASP, the Research and Analysis of Standard Setting Processes Proposed Research Group, which is a real mouthful, which you can see amongst other things they're looking at computationally understanding the IETF consensus process, which gosh, that's complicated as a topic. They're also looking at large language models and various other things. So I personally think that will be really interesting. I think the last item there, I think Jeff Houston's presenting that, making of an RFC in today's IETF. So that will be quite interesting to get his take on that. Knowing Jeff, it will be backed with lots of data. And then, as always, for Wednesday, we round off the day with the IETF plenary in session 4. That's the only item on the agenda for session 4. Based on the discussion in Prague, that could be quite fascinating, I suspect, although that might be a hard act to follow. Again, apologies, let me pause there. Anything I've overlooked, in particular in session 1, I guess, that anyone feels strongly about, or anything else to add anywhere else on the Wednesday? Doesn't look like it at the moment. So let's move on to Thursday. First thing Thursday, if you're feeling energetic, there's a side meeting on enterprise network scenarios, deployment problems and discussion, taking place for an hour and a half before the start of the meeting proper, which I think will be worth attending if your diary allows and you're awake at that point. Then in session 1, we got part 2 of the MIMI working group. Looking more specifically, session 1 was around the use case. Session 2 is more looking at, as you can see, the content format, the architecture, and the protocol. So more on the nitty gritty. At the same time, one of the most contrived titles for a BOF takes place, the Scone protocol BOF, securely communicating network properties to clients. Quite impressed whoever came up with Scone protocol out of all of that, hopefully to be followed by the Jam BOF and then the Cream BOF. But maybe that would be an exercise for people on long plane flights to conjure up potential titles for those, or even Jam and Cream together, perhaps. Anyway, that's looking at the BOF is focused on how networks can provide hints to endpoints, which then can choose whether or not they wish to react to those hints. And the example in the, I think this came out of, it was on the GitHub, was a proposed charter. It suggested as a potential use case, looking at cellular networks, that network providing a hint that a terminal's got a constrained connection, at which point it might choose to modify what it's doing in some way or not, as the case may be. So anyway, the scone BOF in session 1, coinciding with the MIMI working group. There's a sisters lunch after that, and then session 2, the DIN-RG, Decentralization of the Internet Research Group, is taking place, which looks at the sort of various pressures pushing towards or against centralization. There isn't an agenda for that as yet. And that coincides with the DOLT BOF, that's the Detecting Unwanted Location Trackers BOF, which is the third BOF in succession. So there were BOFs on this topic in the last 2 meetings. This is, I think, the third and last BOF before a decision is made on whether or not to move forward with it. And as the title infers, for those of you that haven't had the pleasure of that one yet, it's looking at unwanted location trackers, so things like air tags that perhaps been placed by a controlling partner on someone. There are other use cases, but that's the example. So that's also in session 2, and then session 3, the ADD Adaptive DNS Discovery Working Group has got a sort of 2-part meeting. Part 1 looking at there's some last calls, an adoption call, a couple of other things. Apologies for the typo on the right hand side on that. But then the second part of the meeting is I think our illustrious co-chairs have titled an architectural directions discussion, which I tried to summarize on the left hand side, which is having a discussion on the philosophy around how security, trust and service identity is done, how it's protected and designed, and how it's evolving, and whether we should go with things like zero trust certificates, etc., or whether we need to look at solutions which work better with operationally deployed networks and services. I'm reading the words on the screen. So those of you involved in networking, I think that will be well worth your time. And then session 4, the moment just has a technology deep dive also on BGP. So a nice follow-up from the one taking place on Sunday afternoon. So if you're present on Sunday and also make this one, you'll be a lot more knowledgeable about BGP, I'm sure. And then in the evening on Thursday, there's a new participant social hour, which I don't think you have to pre-register for, but anyone that might be interested in that's worth checking if you do or not. But that's just an hour with further networking. Again, let me stop and see if anyone's got anything to add for the Thursday component. Not seeing any hands raised currently, but I can see that Eric has rather impressively come up with T, presumably to have with the scones, as it says, Terminal Endpoint Authorization Protocol. That I think we need to work backwards from the title to do something around that. Well done. There's the prize is the admiration of your peers, I think, for coming up with that so swiftly. Most impressive. Okay, right, let me move on just to wrap this up. On the Friday, as always, well, certainly for the last few meetings on Friday, we've got an EODIA Directorate side meeting. That's the Education and Outreach Directorate side meeting. Always a challenge to make that on the Friday morning, but there you are. Certainly gets me out of bed in the morning, which is no bad thing. Then we got the last of the BOFs, the SRv6 operations BOF, taking place. And at the same time as that, the SCIT, Supply Chain Integrity, Transparency and Trust working group is taking place. With both of those, there wasn't an agenda when I looked yesterday afternoon, so I haven't really got a whole lot more to add than just the generic descriptions I've included on the screen. There's a security, the only thing on session 2 that caught my eye was a security area open meeting. And then session 3, the DNS Ops working group has the second of its 2 sessions, which amongst other things includes a report from the Deleg BOF from earlier in the week, just to bring that back into the main sort of DNS ops community. So no doubt that will trigger something of a discussion, I would imagine. And then we wrap up the meeting with, as happened in Prague, a farewell reception for those people that haven't sort of got an early flight home on the Friday afternoon. So a chance just to reminisce before we all head our separate ways. Right, that's everything from me. Apologies, that's a pretty swift run through, but just to give you a flavour of things that caught my eye. Again, any comments, anything else you think's been overlooked from any of that? Feel free to jump in if so. Not seeing anyone looking like they're wanting to do that. Right, in which case, I'll move on. If anything crops up, we can pick it up under AOB. Right, so let me just carry on with some recent headlines, which those of you that get the weekly email would have picked up earlier today. A sort of discussion, I think this was on the APNIC podcast, yes it was, from George Michelson, just talking about DANIC. I think following on from Jeff Houston's blog post from 3-4 weeks ago now, about 4 weeks ago now. So APNIC certainly put quite a lot of sort of time onto sharing sort of views on DELEG. So those of you that are interested in that may wish to catch up with George's thoughts. In the meantime, Jeff put out an interesting piece looking at digital sovereignty and standards, which I think really thought-provoking as always. I found it was sort of well worth a read. It looked at some sort of history, sort of gave some useful context of the subject, and one of his conclusions, I think, was that public sector bodies should be more involved in the IETF, but there's a lot more content than just that. So again, if you've got time on a plane in the next few days, that could be a useful thing to all right, read through. As always, I'm not going to go through all of the rest. You'll see piece on DNS tunneling from Steve Staden and DNS Filter, has been on this call previously. Also from DNS Filter, quite a interesting observation about a spike in DNS queries driving phishing and cyber attacks, which coincided with a few different pieces also looking at various types of malicious content, malware, etc. So as always, sadly, there's a number of different things there which you can read through at your leisure if those are of interest. Yeah, there's a very short, pithy summary from the 8th Cybersecurity Standardization Conference, and the Eurodig draft programs available for the meeting mid this year, for those of you more interested in policy matters. Oh, actually, this is, so apologies, I didn't update this. This is an early side, so disregard this. This is one from last week, which I forgot to delete. So but probably worth mentioning anyway, that the IETF did put out a post on social media around a week or so ago, just with some suggested topics of interest on the agenda. So by all means, sort of take a look at those as well. I think they thought they were particularly ones which will be relatively easy to engage with, as opposed to things that you need to be involved with for some considerable time. Also, there's a sort of second solicitation about the hot RFC session on the Sunday evening. So still time to put forward your proposals if you've not done that. And then a whole lot of other news this week. The only two I'll mention, the top of the screen there, you'll see that the Digital Markets Act, some designated gatekeepers of very large online services now need to comply with all of the obligations of the Act. So that's just really kicking in sort of fully in anger for the first time. Then at the bottom, the very bottom item, you'll see CISA, the sort of US Cybersecurity Agency, has announced some new efforts to help the open source ecosystem. There's a sort of few other bits and pieces in between on governance and other things, as you can see. Again, for you to look at your leisure if those are of interest to you. There's quite a few calls for papers coming up over the next few months, but one's finishing this week. If you want to present at RIPE, you've got till close today to put your proposals in. And I've mentioned the hot RFC talks. You've got until the end of this week. I think that's Friday the 15th to put in any 4-minute presentation proposals for consideration by the organisers. Then there's various other things coming up, as you can see, some fellowship for APNIC, for example, call for presentations for RIPE 88, etc. So again, you'll be able to sort of click on these from when I put up a link to the recording. So if any of those are of interest to you and you don't get the weekly headlines by email, either tell me and I'll add you to the mailing list for that, or just take a look at the webpage with the recording link and you'll have them there as well. Okay, and then later on this week, Echo, the German-based technology, technology industry group has got a readout from last week's ICANN meeting. So it's only an hour or so, a lot more time efficient than spending a week in Puerto Rico. And then, of course, this coming sort of next weekend, the 16th, is the kickoff of the IETF meeting. Plenty more stuff taking us through the first half of the year, as you can see. Right. So a reminder, finally, we won't have a call next week because it clashes with IETF, but we will have one sort of the following Monday, just calling out some of the highlights from the week just gone. So those of you that aren't attracted to the idea of attending remotely may find that useful. And indeed, those of you that were there, again, as with today, feel free to participate to share your thoughts on the most interesting sessions. Right, so that's more than enough of me sort of talking, I think. Much too much of a good thing, as my wife often says. So let me stop there and see, does anyone have anything else that you want to mention, either to do with the ITF meeting or indeed anything else? So anything that's on your minds at the moment. And if you do, raise your virtual hand or pop something in the chat if that's easier. Just pause for a minute or so to see if anyone does. Perhaps whilst you're thinking, I do have a question which came into my inbox earlier on. If I can just see it, and this is not DNS related, but does anyone have sort of knowledge of and strong opinions of either DANE or MTA-STS? And if so, be interested. Yeah, don't need to discuss it on this call, but be interested to have a chat, perhaps separately, if you do. Because somebody asked me if there was anyone I could find that had thoughts on those two standards as they apply to securing email services. So DANE and MTA-STS. So just let me know separately if that's something that you have expertise in or know anyone that does. Right, has anything occurred to anyone in the meantime that you'd like to mention this week? seeing any hands raised currently. I don't see anything in the chat. Right, well, in which case, let's draw a line there. So we're sort of slightly earlier this week than some. Those of you that are going to be in Brisbane, be good to see you when you arrive. I think on land Thursday lunchtime-ish in Brisbane. So, and I'm staying in the conference hotel, but I think the other sort of suggested hotels are all pretty close proximity anyway. So if you're there in person, do say hello. I'm sure there'll be plenty of time for sort of catching up properly. Other than that, if you're joining remotely, well done. Impressive effort. I don't envy you. And look forward to catching up with we can share our highlights after the week's gone by in a flash on the Monday the 25th. So have a fantastic couple of weeks in the meantime, and catch up Monday 2 weeks. See you all then. Thanks everyone. Bye.